I was abused by my Freemason father, who was also a Rosicrucian and a member of the Golden Dawn sect. If you think Freemasonry is a charitable organisation, sorry, you need to learn the truth. If you're a perpetrator, if you're a pedophile in this state, you are a protected species. And I know that from personal experience because I've outed many of them and none of them were charged, including my father, who was allowed to die a very comfortable death. And he wasn't just an abuser of children, a perpetrator of sexual abuse and ritual sexual abuse. He was a murderer, and I was a witness to that. Sadly, it's Freemasonry that controls a lot of what happens in our country. On the subject of SRA again, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison's recently been under full-on attack by the mainstream media for daring to speak about ritual sexual abuse in his sorry speech way back in 2018.
I move that the House apologise to the victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. The crimes of ritual sexual abuse happened in schools, churches, youth groups, scout troops, orphanages, foster homes.
But close observers of the process were taken aback by the use of the phrase ritual sexual abuse.
My father was a Freemason. He was a Satanist, a Luciferian, a Freemason, a Golden Dawn member. My father's grandfather was a man called Joseph Wright, who was the Grand President of the Grand Lodge, and I've been told that's a very, very high up Freemason. Now, my father's mother was an Order of Australia medal recipient, which is like an OBE. She was a JP. She was very high up in politics. So and this is going back, when women didn't have any power. So she was a very powerful woman, probably because of who her father was. So I think that there's a family line there that it's very unlikely that my father would have been born into that family line and not have been abused himself.
All right, so I grew up in Edwardstown in Adelaide of South Australia. I was born in 1973. I had 5 older siblings, 1 younger sibling that I didn't meet until 2012. My older siblings, of those, the eldest, Claire, deceased the day after she received a compensation payout, which is an unusual time for someone to supposedly take their life, but that's what the coroner has assumed. And poor Claire, she was saying that someone was trying to kill her for a couple of months before she died, but the coroner won't look into it, so we've lost 1 sibling. My 2 older half-siblings, Ruth and Andrew, corroborate my allegations that our father, Allan Maxwell McIntyre, was a serial pedophile and that they also were witness to dead bodies, murders and body disposals. So they are 18 and 19 years older than me, respectively. And so their witness experiences were in the 50s and 60s, whereas mine were in the 70s and 80s. They were also peddled off to our father's friends. My abuse included satanic ritual abuse as well. In 1981, when I was approximately 8 years old, I was forced to participate in the mutilation of a little blonde boy who looked to me to be around 6 years old. This occurred in a tunnel system which I believe may be the Sleeps Hill tunnels on the outskirts of Adelaide. The Sleeps Hill tunnels are currently owned by a close relative of Anthony Munro. Also, in the early 1980s, I was taken to an Adelaide Hills location where, including myself, about 9 other children, as well as approximately 50 adults, were witness to the murder of a baby boy of around 10 months old. This murder was conducted by a man whom I have identified as looking remarkably similar to a former Attorney General of South Australia. The baby was handed to this man by a young woman with bright red hair and blue eyes, who was wearing a hooded floor-length green cape. This was the most horrific of the child murders which I was forced to witness as a child. And I won't describe the death of this baby as it's too horrific. However, I will say that the death involved fire and prepared this poor little child's body for consumption by the audience. My father offered some of that poor baby's cooked flesh to me that day, but I refused to eat it. He insisted repeatedly that I try the meat as it was important for the rest of the group to see that I had participated in the ritual, but I refused.
Did you then, were you then regularly sexually abused and abused in this cult-like manner?
Yes, unfortunately.
You lived with him And your mother lived with you too?
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, my father had an ability to hypnotise her very easily. So it was just a rapid induction technique that he would use. It was very
Wow.
effective. So she would be out to it, and so we'd be abused in front of her and she wouldn't know.
Wow. Like that. That's strong. So she was completely gone, like spaced out while you were being sexually abused by him in front of her.
Yes, and then completely just gobsmacked when she would be brought out and we'd be hysterical and she wouldn't understand why.
So he had special gift in that sense that he could induce this hypnotic state in your mother, who was clearly very receptive to it also.
Yeah,
So did he do things like that with you and the other children too?
He did, yes. He had a technique with me, which became obsolete at one point, where he would tell me to everything that had just happened. It would just be locked away, and I would lock my lips because I wouldn't talk about it. And then I would take the key that had locked my lips and I would swallow it. And then at one point I eventually, and I've spoken about this in many interviews, I eventually said to him, but hang on, how can I open my lips to swallow the key when...
So this is sort of mind control training, where you have a technique to lock away the memories so that it never happened. It's locked away in some part of your being that you have no access to.
Yeah.
So that's so it's classic mind control training there.
Basically, my father had a lot of friends in the police force, and they did things that weren't right. We as children were offered up to his doctor friends for any experiments they wanted to perform on us. We were involved in child pornography, experimental medicine, you name it. That's what happened. Because my father didn't care about his children. He was a psychopath. He told my sister Ruth, my younger sister, that he only had children and a family as a cover, as a disguise for what he did. So he could have two lives, the family man with children, etc., and then the other life, basically. My father would abduct children, and I'll say this, he used to source his children from the orphanages. They were simply taken out and they were crossed off the list, and then they disappeared. More than about 600 children were reported missing from I think it was the Goodwood orphanage where he used to source his children from, and we're not allowed to know anything about it, okay? Well, my father used to take them to our house right from the late 50s right through to 1965, and he would butcher them in a wooden house down the back. And he would sell their body parts to a friend of his who was the chief surgeon at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. My father used to make pornographic movies with these children that he'd take out of the orphanage. Now, I wasn't there, but my sisters were. And there were animals involved, like dogs, etc. There were people with professional cameras, lighting equipment, those umbrellas that open up to diffuse light, full on child pornography. And that was normal. And there'd be police coming to our house. They were friends of my father.